Michael Chandler has spent the last 4 years of his career chasing one fight. One man. One payday that was supposed to change everything. And every single time he got close, every time the contracts were being talked about, every time the press conferences were being planned, every time the internet lost its mind over the possibility, it fell apart. And now, with Conor McGregor officially announced to fight Max Holloway at International Fight Week, Michael Chandler is sitting in a fight camp for the White House card, cutting weight to fight Mauricio Ruffi, telling the media with a straight face that he still believes the McGregor fight is going to happen. This is one of the most fascinating and honestly painful stories in recent MMA history. And we need to talk about all of it. Let's go back to the beginning, because the context here is everything. It was UFC 274. Michael Chandler had just finished one of the most spectacular post-fight interviews in recent memory, calling out Conor McGregor at 170 pounds with a kind of raw energy that makes casual fans stop scrolling and actually watch. That clip got 2.7 million views. At the time, it felt like the natural next step: two explosive strikers, two massive personalities, a fight that wrote itself. The problem was that Conor McGregor had essentially disappeared from active competition at that point, and nobody knew when or if he was actually coming back. Chandler kept the fire alive in interviews, kept putting McGregor's name out there, kept making himself the loudest voice in the room whenever the subject came up. And for a long time, it looked like the patience was going to pay off. Fast forward to early 2024. Michael Chandler shows up on Monday Night Raw, yes, WWE, calling out McGregor again, nearly 2 full years after that original UFC 274 interview. And the clip is exactly what you'd expect. Maximum energy, maximum commitment, screaming into the camera about unfinished business. It was theatrical, and it was slightly unhinged, and it was completely Michael Chandler. And then, just 6 weeks later, at the UFC 300 post-fight press conference, Dana White pulled out a piece of paper, literally read from notes, which he said had never happened before, and announced Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler for UFC 303 in Newark, New Jersey on June 29th. The internet exploded. The MMA world finally felt like the fight was actually going to happen. Chandler had waited, had stayed relevant, had kept himself in the conversation, and it looked like the patience had finally been rewarded. It wasn't. A few weeks later, the UFC cancelled a scheduled press conference in Dublin, Ireland that was supposed to be a formal kickoff for the fight. And then came the announcement everyone had been dreading. McGregor was out of UFC 303 with an injury. The replacement main event was announced. The card moved on. And Conor McGregor once again disappeared from the active roster without throwing a single punch in the cage. For Michael Chandler, this was devastating. Not just financially, not just in terms of legacy, but in terms of what it did to his trajectory as a fighter. He had been holding himself in a specific place, maintaining a specific profile, specifically for this fight. And it evaporated. Here is where the story gets complicated in a way that most people haven't fully examined. According to McGregor's own management, the Chandler fight was actually the fight they wanted. His manager told multiple outlets that they had specifically requested Chandler, not Max Holloway. Which means when Dana White sat in that room and laughed about someone asking whether McGregor and Chandler were still a realistic possibility, saying, "That was a couple years ago, bro," with genuine amusement, it wasn't McGregor pulling away from the fight. It was the UFC making a deliberate choice to go in a different direction. And that detail changes the entire narrative. Dana White didn't give Chandler the fight because Dana White decided not to. Full stop. Why would the UFC make that decision? There are 2 theories, and both of them have merit. The first is commercial. Max Holloway versus Conor McGregor is simply a bigger fight than Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler. Holloway has been one of the most consistently elite and active fighters on the roster for years. He's coming off a knockout of Justin Gaethje that is still being talked about as one of the great moments in UFC history, and a rematch with McGregor from a fight they had over a decade ago carries its own historical weight. The second theory is more cynical and more interesting. McGregor has not signed a new long-term deal with the UFC. He's on the final 2 fights of his existing contract. And there is a real argument to be made that by giving McGregor the hardest possible fight instead of the most winnable one, the UFC is putting pressure on him: either perform at the highest level and justify a new deal, or lose and have your leverage disappear entirely. Giving McGregor a fight against Chandler, a man who many believe McGregor beats relatively cleanly given where both careers currently are, would have given McGregor a win, a boost in negotiating power, and a reason to demand more. Giving him Holloway removes that cushion. It's a calculated move, and the UFC has made calculated moves before. Meanwhile, Michael Chandler is preparing for the White House event against Mauricio Ruffi, who is one of the most dangerous finishers on the entire roster. Ruffi's wheel kick alone is the kind of weapon that ends nights without warning. This is not a soft consolation fight. This is a legitimate threat to Chandler's health and career, dressed up as a make-good for the McGregor situation. And Chandler is taking it. Because what else is he going to do? He's fought Charles Oliveira. He's fought Paddy Pimblett. He stayed active, stayed professional, stayed positive through all of it. He goes on camera days before a major weight cut looking visibly drained, and he tells the interviewer, with composure that honestly deserves some respect, that he's a million miles away from the McGregor situation emotionally and his focus is entirely on Ruffi. And then, in the same breath, he says that he and McGregor will compete against each other at some point, somewhere, somehow. And you can read that two ways. Either it's genuine belief from a man who refuses to let go of the biggest opportunity of his career, or it's the kind of thing a fighter says to stay relevant in a conversation that has already moved on without him. The McGregor management comment is actually the most important piece of new information in this entire story. Because if McGregor's team wanted Chandler, if they specifically asked for that fight, and the UFC overruled it and gave them Holloway instead, then Chandler has been victimized by two different forces simultaneously. He's been strung along by McGregor's injury history and inability to stay healthy and active. And he's been dismissed by a promotional structure that decided his name wasn't big enough for the specific commercial moment they were trying to create. Neither of those things is his fault. He showed up. He stayed ready. He coached the Ultimate Fighter opposite McGregor, gave the show legitimate drama, kept his end of every arrangement that was put in front of him. The system simply decided his value was limited to being a supporting character in someone else's story. There's also something worth addressing about the specific matchup of McGregor versus Chandler as a fight. The conventional wisdom has actually been wrong about this one. People assume because Chandler is a top-ranked lightweight with elite athleticism and genuine knockout power that he would be a difficult fight for McGregor on paper. And the athleticism and power are real. But Chandler's fight IQ has been a legitimate concern throughout his career. He has been in wars that a more disciplined fighter wouldn't have needed to be in. He absorbs damage in exchanges that a technically cleaner fighter would have avoided. Against someone with McGregor's timing and precision on the counter, when McGregor is properly prepared, which remains the central question mark of his entire comeback, Chandler is actually one of the more readable opponents in the division. He comes forward. He commits hard. He leaves openings. McGregor's left hand has ended nights faster and against more difficult problems than that. The analysis that Chandler is a winnable fight for McGregor isn't disrespect to Chandler. It's an honest technical reading of the matchup. Which brings us to the Holloway decision and what it tells us about where this is all heading. If McGregor wins against Holloway, he becomes relevant in title conversations again. At lightweight against Ilia Topuria or Islam Makhachev. At welterweight against Islam or the winner of the division's evolving picture. And suddenly a new long-term deal gets signed because McGregor's leverage is restored. In that scenario, Chandler might still get his fight eventually, not as the comeback opponent, but as the reward fight after McGregor has validated himself against real elite competition. If McGregor loses to Holloway and has one fight left on his deal, the UFC gives him the easiest possible win to send him out on, which might actually be Chandler after all. So there is a universe where the fight happens. It's just not the universe Chandler imagined when he was screaming into cameras in 2022. The real tragedy of this story isn't that the fight didn't happen. It's that Michael Chandler organized a significant portion of his late career around the possibility of it happening, and the people who held the power to make it happen used that willingness against him. He stayed patient, and they interpreted it as availability. He stayed positive, and they interpreted it as being manageable. He kept calling for the fight publicly, and they used the attention it generated without delivering the paycheck it was supposed to produce. In a sport built on toughness, the way Michael Chandler has been handled in this entire saga is its own kind of test. And whatever happens at the White House against Ruffi, he's still standing. Still competing at the highest level. Still making himself impossible to ignore. The Conor McGregor fight may be dead. The Michael Chandler story is absolutely not. Here is where this ends, at least for now. Chandler goes to the White House and fights Ruffi. If he wins, genuinely wins, convincingly, He puts himself back in the conversation and forces the UFC to address what comes next. If McGregor loses to Holloway and has one fight left on a contract the UFC isn't trying to extend, the economics of a Chandler fight might look attractive again simply because there aren't many other options. But if Chandler loses to Ruffy, this chapter closes quietly. And the most persistent, most patient, most publicly dedicated pursuit of a single fight in recent MMA history ends not with a bang, but with a wheel kick and a stretcher and Joe Rogan sticking a microphone in Chandler's face one more time. Whatever he says into that microphone, you already know what name is going to come out of his mouth.